In the last lecture, we were examining how to write a SRS document. We identified what are the important information that SRS document must have. We said it must, one of the most important information that is present in the SRS document is the functional requirement. We were discussing what exactly is a functional requirement. We said a functional requirement is a facility offered by a software to the users, using which the user can get some meaningful work done. And then we are discussing how to document the functional requirement. We said that for each functional requirement, we must give an overview of the functional requirement, that is what exactly it will achieve, and then the input data that will be given and the output that will be produced, and also the processing. The processing should be in terms of maybe validation of the input data. It can be the exact sequence of the operations that will be carried out. It can also contain responses to abnormal situations, and also any methods or description of algorithms, equations that can be used to transform the input to output. Now, let us try to see what exactly is a non-functional requirement. A non-functional requirement is a characteristic which cannot be characterized or expressed as a function. A function is a feature using which a user can get meaningful work done, but there are some requirements which are not like the functional requirements. For example, we might say that it should run using both Windows and the Unix environment. It should be easily maintainable. It should have a graphical user interface that can be used in a standalone mode or through a web browser. It should be extremely secure, etc. So, these are all examples of non-functional requirement. These apply to the software as a whole, and these are not a functionality or a feature offered to the user to get some meaningful work done. It can also include reliability issues, that it should not fail frequently, and if it fails, should be able to recover the data quickly. It can also contain performance issues. Non-functional requirements can also contain performance issues. For example, how fast the system should produce result. We can say that the response time should be less than 1 second 90% of the time, or we may say that it should not produce result too fast, such that the other systems that work with it are not overloaded. But for all non-functional requirement, we have to ensure that some way we can test that. That is, we should be able to measure and see if the non-functional requirement, there is a conformance to that. Another important section in the requirements document are the constraints. For example, what hardware to be used, what are the other software with which it needs to work, the operating system to be used, the capabilities of the I/O devices, whether any standards compliance is needed, data representation, the interface system, these are all constraints. And then the external interface requirement, this is also an important section. We need to document the requirements for the user interface. The interfaces with other hardware with which it needs to work, with other software the interfaces. For example, we might say that for other software it need to produce a XML file or maybe a comma separated file, a text file, comma separated text file. The communication interface with other systems, file export formats, etc. There is another section which is the goal of implementation. For both functional requirement, non-functional requirement, constraints, we need to check whether after the software is complete, we need to test whether these are satisfied. Whereas, goals of implementation are just general suggestions which can help the developer to see what is required, but these will not be tested. For example, under the goal of implementation, we might say that it should be very reliable, because we will use it in a, because this will be used in a very critical application. But then as long as it is under the section goal of implementation, this will not be tested, it is only a guideline or it is a suggestion to the developers. Now, let us look at the IEEE 830 standard. This is the standard format of writing the SRS document. Most developers use this standard, and of course, there are small variations to the standard, but if we know the IEEE 830 standard, should be able to have small variations of this. Now, let us look at what are the sections of the IEEE 830 standard. Title, that is name of the software, table of contents, and then there are three main sections. One is the introduction, overall description, and the specific requirements, and then there are the appendix and index. The introduction should have a purpose, a subsection called as purpose, scope, definition, acronym, abbreviations, references, and overview. The purpose should say that what the system will serve, it is a general introduction, and describe who are the users. The scope, very overall idea about what the system will do, what it will not do, very crisply written, an overall description of what is expected of the system and what it should not do. Then there are the various terminologies like definitions, acronyms, abbreviations that will be used in the SRS document, but often in variation to the standard these are put under the appendix. Similarly, a set of documents that are referred in the SRS document these references can also be put under a separate appendix. And then an overview of the document or organization of the document, how the SRS is organized. And that is about the introduction. Now, let us look at the overall description. This is the section 2. The subsections here are the product perspective, product functions, user characteristics, constraints, assumptions and dependencies. In the product perspective, we write here the business case, that is how it will help the customer, how it will benefit, how it will be used and so on, and even might write about the external interfaces briefly, the overview of what type of users, hardware, software etcetera will be used, and then any constraints on the memory or operational constraints, site constraints and so on. The product functions, this is not really the functional requirement specification, but a brief overview or a summary of the functional capabilities. For example, in a library, we might just write very briefly saying that the library software should serve the users for their issuing of books, returning, for the librarian to create members, manage books and so on, and for the accountant to manage the financial aspects of the library. The user characteristics are the technical skills of each user class. This is also required because finally, the user interface development, we will need the user characteristics. If it is software is to be used by factory workers as well and programmers, we need to have different user interfaces. So, we need to identify the user characteristics and how much, what are their technical skills, how well they are conversant with the computers and so on. The constraints here, what are the platform that will be used, the database that will be used, the network development standards and so on. And then if there are any assumptions here, dependencies, need to mention that. And then let us look at the third section. This is possibly the most important section. Here we have the external interfaces, functions, that is this is the major section here. This contains the functionalities, the functional requirement, the non-functional requirement, logical database requirement, design constraints, quality attributes and any object oriented models. In this section has to be written very carefully and in sufficient detail, so that the designers can have all the information they need to carry out the development work, and for the testers to be able to write the test cases. It is a very important section. While writing the functional requirement, we should make sure that we have as far as possible all the input or stimulus to the system, output that is produced by the system and the functionalities. Now, first let us look at the external interface. Here we have to write about all the user interface. Maybe you can give GUI screenshots, the different file formats that may be needed. It should actually, there are some part that were mentioned in the section 2, external interface. It should actually elaborate that and should not duplicate information there. This is the main section, the functional requirements. This will contain the detailed specification of each functionality or use case, including collaboration and other diagrams. We will see these diagrams later. Then the performance requirements, the logical database requirement, what are the different data that will be stored in the database, their relationship. The design constraints are standard compliance. For example, may say that I have to use UML 2.0 and have to use, let us say, Misra C for writing the code. The quality attributes and then any object oriented models like class diagram, state, collaboration diagram, activity diagram, etc., can be included. But then the section 3 that we just saw now is just one example, and IEEE 830 specifies that there can be different organization of the section 3 based on the modes of the software. That is, a software may be having a expert mode, a novice mode, and so on. If there are modes are there, then we might have to organize it such that the modes, the software is written in terms of the modes. Sorry, the SRS document is written in terms of the modes. Similarly, depending on different user classes, concepts, features, stimuli, there can be slightly different organization of the section 3. We just look at we examined a very typical organization of the section 3, but there can be variations of the section 3. Now, let us look at the functional requirements. As we said that this is one of the most important part of the document. Let us take an example of a academic administration software or AAS. So, we write here section 3.1 functional requirements, and then we write various functional requirements, and they might have sub functions. For example, we organize the subject registration, that is 3.1.1, and then there can be several functionalities for subject registration. The first function may be the system shall allow student to register subject. Second function can be allows a student to drop a course. Third one is that it support checking how many students have already registered for a course. Similarly, the design constraints, we give a number to each constraint and then write that AAS software should provide user interface through standard web browsers. It should use an open source RDMS. It should be developed using Java programming language. So, these become different constraints. And then the non-functional requirements, again we give a number to each for traceability. It should respond to query in less than 5 seconds. It should operate with 0 downtime, should allow up to 100 users to remotely connect to the system. The system should be accompanied by a well written user manual. So, these are non-functional requirements. Now, let us focus on the functional requirements, because we should be able to write a good SRS document. We must know what are the granularity to which we must document the functions and what exactly are the functional requirements. Let us look at it in further detail. As we have already mentioned that every software we can view it as performing a set of functions. let us say a software. So, this is a software which let us say supports 3 functions, function 1, function 2 and function 3. Using each function, the user should be able to achieve something, and each function will typically take some input, and the system should process that input and produce some output. We can think of each function as taking some input data and through some processing activity or function or a function transforms the input data to some output data. Let us take an example of a query book. Takes the name of the book as the input data, searches the book database and produces all the books details that match the given book name. Now, let us take some example. Let us say the search book. The search book, let us say it takes name of the book, sorry, author's name. So, then we can write the input is author name and the output is details of the author's books and the locations of this book in the library. Each functional requirement we call as a high level requirement. A high level requirement takes some data and produces some result, but then each high level requirement may consist of sub requirements or sub functions. Each functional requirement is described in terms of input data, the data that is input which the function uses to produce the output data, and what processing it does to produce the output data from the input data. We had already said that a high level function is one or a functional requirement using which the user can get some useful piece of work done. But suppose we take the example of a ATM machine, a bank ATM. What are the functionalities or the requirements of this ATM machine? One can be withdraw cash, one can be query balance, one can be deposit cash. But let us say during the withdrawal cash, it asks whether to print a receipt or not. Is printing the receipt can be considered as a functional requirement? The answer is no, because as per our definition of a functional requirement, it takes some input from the user and produces some useful piece of work for the user. The receipt was actually printed as part of the withdrawal. It is not that you just printed the receipt, the user requested to print receipt and it printed. It is always executed as part of the cash withdrawal, and therefore, it is a sub function of the cash withdrawal requirement. Every high level requirement typically accepts some data from user, transforms it the response and then outputs this response to the user. Little later we will look at the UML where the requirements are specified using use cases. The use cases have become standard. These have definite notation how the functionalities are represented, and these are much more well defined than just loosely writing the requirements. So, many times the requirements are specified using use cases. Now, let us look at some few example functional requirement. We need to number the requirement and then write that once the user selects the search option, ask to enter the keywords. The system should output details of all books whose title or author match the keywords, and the details that will be output include these items: title, author name, publisher name, year of publication, etc. Similarly, we can number the second requirement. Requirement 2, when the renew option is selected, the user is asked to enter the membership number and password. After password validation, list of books borrowed by him are displayed, and then the user can renew the any book by clicking on the corresponding renew box. Just see that this is written in rather free form, in the way that the sequence of operations are carried out. That initially the renew option is selected, this is done by the user, and the computer asks the user to enter the membership number and password, and after password validation the books borrowed by him are displayed, and then the user can renew the book by clicking the corresponding renew box. We can realize that every high level function actually is a series of interaction between the system and the user. The user inputs something, based on that the system does some processing, produces some output, and based on that the user enters certain other thing, and so on. So, we can think of every high level function as a series of interactions between the user and the computer. But then for every functional requirement, we must also document the scenarios. The scenarios arise because there are different ways certain things can get accomplished. For example, let us say the cache withdrawal. This is a functional requirement, and then the normal course of cache withdrawal is that the user specifies the amount to be taken, withdrawn, and the system dispenses the cache. There can be other scenarios that the user entered the amount to be withdrawn, and the system should display that it exceeds the account balance. There can be another scenario that the user entered some amount and the system responded that please enter in multiples of 100. So, we have looked at the functional requirement. Every software performs a set of functions for the users, and this has to be carefully documented. Each function or high level requirement consists of a number of scenarios. We will look at some examples in the next lecture, and we will continue from that point onwards. Thank you.